We're going to go ahead and get started. This is the Fine Arts and English Colloquium series. And what this is to showcase and show what faculty actually do besides teaching in the classroom. It is also to give students the opportunity to interact with faculty and their research in a different way. And we also try to foster a type of development of students. So you will see today that we have two English majors that are going to do the introductions and are going to field questions. We're always looking for students to work with and always give students the opportunity to develop their professional vitas and their professional roles on campus. And so the series is set up in a way that every fall we have this colloquium series with the Fine Arts Department and the English Department, and then in the spring we have the English Department colloquium series. Now all of this comes out of one particular office, but we're working towards now the Circling Our Wagons Hip Hop Conference. So if you're interested in that, please make sure you see me. We also have a book and film club that will begin in October. This is also another event that you can take part of. So if you see flyers and things for these events around campus, please feel free to join us. So I want to introduce the two students that we have working with us today. In the front here we have Brandy Johnson, who is an English education major. By her side is Kiara Lawrence, who is an English major. And again, they will do the introductions. And my name is Andre Johnson. I'm assistant professor here in the English department, and I turn the mic over to one of these two ladies.
Good morning, everyone. I will be introducing to you Dr. Patricia Bonner. Dr. Patricia Bonner received her bachelor's degree from the University of Alabama, her master's degree from Atlanta University, and her PhD from the University of South Florida. Her areas of study are African American and American literature. Dr. Bonner taught at North Carolina A&T for 17 years and as a tenured professor in the English department before relocating to her home state of Georgia and taking a new job here at Albany State University. She has held many positions while teaching. Some include serving as the interim associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, creating and editing the English department's literary and art journal, serving as the coordinator for African American literature, and serving as the director of freshman composition for 9 years. Additionally, she created the English department's writing center and served as its director for 4 years. Dr. Bonner's primary interest is African American literature, and one of her academic missions is to show the manner in which this literature reflects the truth of the Black experience in America. She has also been a student-centered teacher who seeks to empower students through giving them knowledge in their history, literature, and culture so that they may know their own potential for greatness. I introduce to you Dr. Patricia Bonner.
I'm almost tempted to say good morning, class, but good morning, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk about blues portraits of Black women in Langston Hughes' blues poetry. Langston Hughes' harmonious creation of realistic Black characters, infused with Black music and embedded in Black culture, produced a poetry that sang the blues poetically. He wrote with an awareness of the ugliest effects of racism and oppression on African American life in the North and the South. For Hughes, the blues is a melodic metaphor for the misery and poverty in the lives of common Black people. He recorded the characters' battles with the blues in his first 2 volumes of poetry entitled The Weary Blues and Fine Clothes to the Jew. One of the most striking features of his blues poetry is his creation of blues women who sing of their struggles in personal relationships, and some are captured in poetic photographs that reveal the damage that oppression and hardships have taken on their bodies, their spirits, and their lives. Firmly embedded in the reality of Black life in America, Hughes's literary sensibility and Black awareness had their roots in his roots. From the beginning of his life in Joplin, Missouri, most of Hughes's life was like a bluesy wail with flashes of joy. His brilliant artistic talent dazzled the world, but his personal life was characterized by struggle. Born in 1902, 37 years after the provisional end of slavery, Hughes lived during the time when America's oppressive grip on African Americans was strong. Most African Americans were still uneducated, impoverished, discriminated against, and all lived within the restrictions of Jim Crow. In his autobiography, The Big C, Hughes admitted that much of his childhood was characterized by loneliness and poverty, two major ingredients of a blues character. After he grew up and left home, he experienced the problems of day-to-day living which a poor Black man in the early 1920s would face. Constantly plagued by financial problems, Hughes did menial work, asked for financial support from whomever and wherever he could, and wrote as if he were saving his life. While in college and after, he would rather spend time with the plainest, blackest, poorest folk in the city, where they sang the blues, shot pool, talked trash, ate watermelon, chicken, barbecue without apology, and drank liquor. Because he hung out with the common brothers and sisters, he knew how to sing their blues poetically. He went to blues and jazz clubs and storefront churches. High society life and pretense didn't impress him. In short, he knew how to get his hustle on, even getting wealthy white patrons to help support his career as a writer. Hughes has been frequently quoted as saying throughout his career that he wrote most when he was unhappy. Unhappiness and dissatisfaction were not the only elements of Hughes's life or his character, just like the blues is not just a song of misery. He had a ready laugh and an irresistible urge to be kind to those struggling. Hughes was qualified to sing the blues. The term blues refers to a number of separate entities: an emotion, a technique, a musical form, and a song lyric. The term the blues derives from someone experiencing a fit of the blue devils, which refers to a mood of despondency or a range of emotional hardships that can be experienced by anyone. However, blues scholar Franklin Rosemont said that a particular misery and sadness, a particular blues, unites African Americans rooted in a theoretical democracy and racist attitudes that were granted authority by law. The blues is the Black rumble of discontent. It is a music about African American life and the capacity to survive in an extreme situation of oppression. The blues helps African Americans to embrace the reality and truth of the Black experience and express their sorrows over hard luck, a bad love affair, or unrequited love, broken family life, or general dissatisfaction with the cold and trouble-filled world. But the blues is not just a sad song. Richard Wright said that a strange and emotional joy is found in contemplating the Blackest aspects of life. A singer in a Louisiana prison declared, and I quote, "Whenever you get the blues just right, why you feel like a million when you may not have a dime. That's the best part of my life, the blues." The classical blues song has a standard structure and style, and Hughes transferred this into poetry. But the classical blues form has a 3-line stanza. There's an original statement, which is repeated, possibly with a slight word change, followed by another statement that rounds out the first. A blues song may consist of a series of stanzas which embellish or develop or repeat the theme put forward in the first stanza. And here are some examples. Woke up this morning feeling sad and blue. Woke up this morning feeling so sad and blue. Didn't have nobody to tell my troubles to. I've got the blues, but I'm too darn mean to cry. And I cleaned that up for the younger people. I've got the blues, but I'm too darn mean to cry. Before I'd cry, I'd rather lay down and die. But one of the most famous blues songs is B.B. King's The Thrill Is Gone. The thrill is gone. The thrill is gone away. You know you done me wrong, baby, and you'll be sorry someday. Hughes was in tune with the currents of life around him, and he came to regard blues music as a paradigm of the Black experience in America and a metaphor for human life in general. Black life was Black music. Black life was the blues. Although all of the women in the Weary Blues and Fine Clothes to the Jew are not blues characters, I will be focusing on selected portraits of blues women. The poems I have chosen today have one thing in common. They contain very tragic pictures of African American women. Some sing of the misery that comes from bad relationships. They cry over no good men who abuse them, leave them, or mistreat them. Some, however, do fight back. Others ask for and accept the abuse. Some are victims of poverty and suffer the consequences of having to live a hard life. All are damaged in some way, but they live, and one is led to believe that the reason they continue to survive is because they sing the blues. Hughes's keen eye and sensitivity to the struggles and suffering of women and the suffering that they endure are remarkably insightful and realistic. So I want to look at the first poem, and it's called Misery. And I think this woman represents the blues woman who sings this poem. Play the blues for me. Play the blues for me. No other music will ease my misery. Sing a soothing song. Said sing a soothing song, 'cause the man I love done me wrong. Can't you understand? Oh, can't you understand? A good woman's crying for a no good man. Black gal like me has got to hear a blues for her misery. This blues woman wants the blues played for her because no other music but the blues can ease her suffering from being in a bad relationship. Therefore, she has to know and have experienced the healing powers of this music, as well as the soothing melancholy it gives. She speaks in the Black dialect, which sounds realistic. In the second stanza, she is singing the blues because the man she loves has mistreated her in some way. So when she repeats the lines, sing a soothing song, said a soothing song, in essence, she begs for the cathartic effect of the blues and gets relief from singing them. In the third stanza, the speaker begs the audience to understand her problem. She loves the man, but she can't let him go. The audience or people who read this poem can relate to her love sickness. This reflects the shared experiences within the African American blues community. The fact that the speaker calls herself a Black gal is also reminiscent of the stigma that many darker-skinned Black women carried about their complexion because of the negativity assigned to it by some of their own race and by whites. But when this dark-skinned girl admits that a good woman's crying for a no good man, She knows that she is not at fault for the trouble in her relationship. In a sense, she knows her worth, but again, she is helpless in her hurt for her man's absence. Note the structure of this poem: 4 stanzas, which have the poetic pattern of a classical blues song. The next poem I want to talk about does not follow the strict poetic blues form, but it evokes a strong blues spirit, tone, and experience. It is called Beale Street Love and contains a dramatic definition of a love that is often found in the blues experience. The entire poem is built on the strength of an extended metaphor. Love is a brown man's fist with hard knuckles, crushing the lips, blackening the eyes. Hit me again, says Clorinda. Now, it's kind of strong. The title places this poem in the area of Memphis, Tennessee on Beale Street, known for its rough black life and rowdy Friday and Saturday nights, blues clubs, and holes in the wall. Containing no rhyme, this poem gains its strength from the progressively harsher image it creates, culminating with equating love with physical abuse. The parallel lines, crushing the lips, blackening the eyes, create a deliberate rhythm with stress on the harshest part of the verb. These 2 lines describe Clorinda's type of love, and the reader is shocked when she makes her deceptively quiet request for her man to hit her again with his hard knuckles. The fact is that there is sometimes an element of masochism found in the blues. Her suffering is private and tolerated. This kind of love exists in the blues community of oppressed and impoverished African Americans, but let's look deeper into Clorinda's experience. For some women, abuse is a part of many relationships because Black men sometimes hit women to keep from feeling blue or powerless or helpless. They lash out at their women because of the frustration they feel from, for example, being called a nigger or not being able to take care of their families. And they cannot lash out at whites, so their women may understand the beating that their manhood takes and restores it in a twisted way by allowing them to release their anger violently towards them. Another view comes from the notion that if a man beats his woman, it is because he cares enough to hit her or chastise her. To a desperate, lonely, and impoverished woman with low self-esteem, a beating can be seen as a form of attention or a form of love. Another view is that a part of loving someone so strongly, so hard, is fighting and enduring abuse. It just comes with the territory of strong love. Finally, this poem suggests that the harsh conditions forced upon African Americans sometimes culminate in unhealthy responses in their social and personal relationships. The brevity of Clorinda's portrait contributes to the mysterious nature of the poem. This leaves the reader with a haunting picture of a blues woman not left with many alternatives. Another blues poem which is written in the classical blues form is Hard Daddy. And we don't mean daddy in the sense of father, it's just a slang for her man, because she doesn't treat him like he's her father. All right, here's the poem Hard Daddy. I went to my daddy, says, Daddy, I've got the blues. Went to my daddy, says, Daddy, I have got the blues. My daddy says, honey, can't you bring no better news? I cried on his shoulder, but he turned his back on me. Cried on his shoulder, but he turned his back on me. He said, a woman's crying's never gonna bother me. I wish I had wings to fly like the eagle flies. Wish I had wings to fly like the eagle flies. I'd fly on my man and I'd scratch out both his eyes. Now, this is obviously a different blues woman. Her man is hard and uncompromising, as indicated by the title. Maybe he is too preoccupied with his own troubles. Maybe he's just simply uncaring and doesn't want to be bothered with her. But at any rate, he's not sensitive to her needs. However, her reaction to her man's callousness is strong and violent. She would like to take the form of an eagle so she could swoop down on him with claws to scratch out both his eyes for being so insensitive to her needs. It is interesting to note that she does not want to fly away to leave him, but if she scratches out his eyes, he won't be able to see other women and will be dependent on her. This blues woman is not a crier, but a vengeful, discontented woman who desperately wants attention. She is unhappy, but she exhibits a fiery side which rears up when she feels wronged. Now, I'd like to share just two more poems that contain pictures of Hughes's blues women, because there are several blues poems in this volume. One is called Young Prostitute. Her dark brown face is like a withered flower on a broken stem. Those kind come cheap in Harlem, so they say. This woman has to sell her body piece by piece in order to live. However, there's no prosperity for her, but slow death, like a dying flower on a broken stem. And in the eyes of many, she has no worth. The last poem is called Troubled Woman. She stands in the quiet darkness, this troubled woman, bowed by weariness and pain, like an autumn flower in the frozen rain, like a wind-blown autumn flower that never lifts its head again. This blues woman stands, as indicated by the first two words of the poem. And so these are the most important words in the poem, because despite having too many burdens heaped on her, she still endures. In conclusion, Hughes conveyed the blues experience of women in his blues poetry through the use of classical blues form, to variations of it, to free verse. Because of his own experiences with poverty and oppression, he was intimately familiar with the blues. However, he was a witness to Black women's struggles and gave them voices and painted pictures of them with words that still resonate today. Today, Native Americans have the highest poverty rate in this country. With 1% difference, African Americans have the second highest poverty rate in this country. A large number of Black women, not all, continue to struggle today with being single head of households, providing for and raising their children. They struggle with being in unhealthy relationships, unhealthy romantic relationships. They struggle with having a positive self-image and self-worth. Stripping, prostitution, and hustling continue to be some of the ways that many women have to survive. But despite all of their adversities, blues women have worth, and Hughes pays homage to them and forever immortalized their struggles and ability to endure in his blues poetry. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Russell Brown. Russell Brown is currently serving as Assistant Professor of Woodwind Studies and Music Theory at Albany State University. Dr. Brown holds a PhD in music composition and an MM in music composition from the University of Florida, an NM in music performance from the Ohio State University, and a BM in music performance from Valdosta State University. He regularly performs contemporary music in various chamber groups and is currently a member of the Albany, Georgia Symphony Orchestra, Valdosta, Georgia Symphony Orchestra, and has performed with the Columbus, Georgia Symphony Orchestra, the Florida Orchestra, which is in Tampa, Gainesville, Florida Chamber of Orchestra, and Ocala Symphony Orchestra. Dr. Brown's compositions have been performed on concerts for local, national, and international audiences in venues across the country. His music has also been performed by the Jacksonville Symphony Orchestra, the Albany Symphony Orchestra, and R20 in Poland. I present to you Dr. Russell Brown.
Welcome. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for showing up today and attending this presentation. This work, Circus Maximus, is best described in the words of John Colloquium himself, who is the composer. Circus Maximus, the Latin words, understandable in English, convey an energy and power by themselves. But the Circus Maximus of ancient Rome was a real place, the largest arena in the world. 300,000 spectators were entertained by chariot races, hunts, and battles. The Roman need for grander and wilder amusement grew as its empire declined. The parallels between the high decadence of Rome and our present time are obvious. Entertainment dominates our reality, and ever more extreme reality shows dominate our entertainment. Many of us have become as bemused by the violence and humiliation that flood the 500 plus channels of our television screens as the mobs of imperial Rome, who consider the devouring of human beings by starving lions just another Sunday show. The shape of Circus Maximus was built both to embody and to comment on this massive and glamorous barbarity. It utilizes a large wind ensemble. It lasts approximately 35 minutes. The work is in 8 sections that are played without pause. The importance of motives and themes can be tracked in this piece by their variation and number of instances. In addition to mere frequency of use, those motives that are most pivotal within the piece are frequently intensified by more dense orchestration. Consistent with traditional symphonic composition, the themes presented early in the piece are important in the large-scale structure. The primitive theme, as we just heard, first introduced in the 12th bar of the first movement, serves as a rondo theme of sorts for the entire piece. The importance of this theme can be justified by its frequency alone. Although presented several times in the first movement, it is not varied outside of truncation in the first 3 movements, with a brief exception at the end of the first movement where the theme becomes arrhythmic. The first variation of this theme occurs in the 6th movement in measure 6. The orchestration is expanded to include the surround band as well. The theme is otherwise unchanged. In this particular piece, it is a 3-dimensional piece, including a stage band, 12 trumpets surrounding the audience, saxophone quartet in the balconies, 4 horns in the balconies, and a clarinet in the rafters. So it's a very 3-dimensional experience. The final statement is varied through rhythmic augmentation. In the final iteration, it is presented in conjunction with the material from the 4th movement. In previous movements, the primitive theme is not presented in conjunction with other themes. The pitch material, even that of a tonal nature, is driven by one of 2 pitch paradigms. The first paradigm involves the use of multiple triads utilizing a common tone to help reinforce the relationship between them. This idea is extended to recursive patterns where the highest note of one pattern becomes the first of the next. The most frequently presented example of the use of this common tone is found in the primitive theme. The harmonic language of the primitive theme, which is first introduced in the interest of the stage band, is polytonal, containing 3 triads, all with F as a common tone. In this polytonal motive, the D-flat major triad dominates the texture, particularly in the lower voices spanning over 5 octaves. The D minor triad, spanning 4 octaves, is accentuated by the figure in the clarinets that we heard in the primitive theme. However, only the euphonium, bass clarinet, and piano contain a D in the lower voices. The weakest of the triads, F major, occurs in the horns and trombones. The triad only spans 1 octave, unlike the other triads. The F major triad is differentiated from D minor, as opposed to D minor 7, by its isolation in the orchestration. The climax of the piece occurs in measure 30 of the 6th movement. Harmonically, it is identical to the primitive theme in the first movement. The melodic element, the primitive call that we just heard, is omitted from this iteration. This orchestration, it is orchestrated more aggressively to include the surround band in extreme dynamics. Even as the orchestration thins, the harmonic scheme remains, continually outlining D-flat major, D minor, and F major. Even though the D-flat is the most dominant triad due to the orchestration, with the D-flat as the lowest pitch, the F becomes more prominent as pitches are removed from the climax. In particular, when the D and D-flat are released into trombones, the final pitch remaining is the middle C in the 3rd clarinets. The common tone paradigm is not limited to harmonic material. This relationship is best represented by the occurrences in the 7th movement, where cadence points are marked when the melody has a consonant common tone with the harmonic material. This is in an otherwise polytonal pitch scheme. In measure 14 of Prayer, the melody is in E major and shifts to B flat major in measure 15. There is a short-lived consonance in the melody where the D is sustained over a D major chord. Dissonance returns when the suspension in the following measure resolves to a C sharp. The melody and harmony are again consonant in measure 18 when the melody cadences. Although the bitonal harmonic scheme adds overall dissonance, common tones provide a chance for consonant cadences to occur. The second pitch paradigm involves the use of patterns offset by a half step. The offsetting can be in reference to the first and last pitch of each set. The primitive theme, in addition to the common tone, also fits this concept with the D-flat major and D minor triads found in the primitive theme. Any use of the octatonic scale can be described this way since it is a series of major seconds offset by a half step. One such example is found in the triad theme. First introduced in the 8th measure of the first movement, the core of this motive is the arpeggiation of 2 triads transposed by 1 half step. It is expanded to include other tertian harmonies, such as 7th chords. The triad theme outlines a D minor and E flat minor triad as found in measure 8. After a harmonically static introduction, the triad motive is the first implication of structured harmony in the piece. In measure 38, and later the clarinet in measure 40, introduces melodic material based on the triad theme. This is the triad theme. The harmonic language is expanded slightly in the clarinet, utilizing a dominant 7 chord instead of a triad. In this case, E flat dominant 7 and E dominant 7. This gesture, similar to the original triad theme, does not have a common tone tying the two chords together. The opening gesture in the percussion, known as the quintuplet motive, is rarely varied rhythmically since rhythm is its primary identifiable characteristic. The only two occurrences of rhythmic variation in this motive are in measure 5 through 7 and measure 9 of the first movement. In this instance, the quintuplet in the snare drum is sometimes replaced by 16th notes or sextuplets. More frequently, this motive is varied through orchestration or spatialization. The first occurs in measure 3, when the quintuplets alternate between the left and right of the audience in the surround snare drums. In some cases, such as measure 72 in the 5th movement, the motive is presented in pitched instruments only. The quintuplet motive is the only theme used in every section of the first movement and is frequently used in conjunction with other themes. The surround theme is first stated in the surround trumpets in the second measure of the movement. Sounding a D5 or a high D, this motive is primarily developed through timbre changes and ornamentation. This begins immediately with the surround trumpets using half valve and wide vibrato. The asynchronous nature of this gesture intensifies the effect. In measure 4, the overtone arpeggio, or rip, is introduced as another form of ornamentation. This theme frequently precedes the primitive theme. The introitus is formally similar to a rounded binary. The most important thematic material of the piece is presented here, as expected. When presented together, the thematic material, in this case, the triad theme and primitive theme, are not blended but juxtaposed. This independent treatment of thematic material is frequent throughout the work. In the second movement, the overall form, in this case, scream siren, can be described as binary, with a second division beginning in the 30th measure. The second is differentiated more by texture than by thematic material. The textural density of the ensemble slowly grows throughout the movement, starting with a duet and the alto saxophones and ending with 10 instruments playing asynchronously at the end. In the third movement, which is by far the most complex, formally speaking, is episodic in nature. This movement has 4 large sections, each containing several subsections or modules that are stylistically extremely contrasting. The first 3, marked D, present several new themes. With each repeat of the D section, the modules become increasingly truncated. Each module is marked less by motivic material and more by the style in which the material is presented. Every shift between sections is marked by woodblock, ratchet, or clicker. The fourth movement is traditional arch form. This movement contains all new material. Much like the second and third, the linear melody is accompanied by tone clusters and aleatoric gestures in the percussion. The material from this movement is prominent in the final 2 movements of the piece. Night Music 2, the 5th movement, is also similar to rounded binary. The second part is more developmental, and the form seems like an arch form with the recapitulation omitted. With regard to form, the 6th movement is episodic and quite similar to the 3rd movement. However, the motivic material is not presented in the same manner or in the same order. The form is not clearly perceptible due to the vertical layering and repeated material. Although the last buildup is marked as the retransition into the 4th movement, functionally, the entire movement is a retransition building to the climax of the piece in measure 30. Formally, the prayer movement is similar to the 4th movement. Like the Circus Maximus, the sections in this movement are not clearly delineated. as in earlier movements, due to the repeating harmonic material and the repeating melodic material. In the final movement, the final movement serves as a coda. The thematic material from the third and sixth remains separate from the material of the fourth and seventh movements. All of the movements are presented attacco with the constant sound from at least one instrument at all times. If all 8 movements are considered as a large-scale movement, the piece as a whole resembles a rondo or a ritornello form. The rondo theme, which here is referred to as the primitive theme, is presented repeatedly throughout the piece. At no point is the primitive theme presented in transposition. The orchestration is varied by reinforcing existing material. If considered a single movement, the first movement can be considered a large A section, the second movement as transitional. With regard to motivic usage, this movement is independent, and since this material does not return in subsequent movements, the third movement, up to measure 87, represents a large B section. The third section would be the fourth and fifth movements. The sixth is more developmental, like as found in the sonata rondo form, and serves as a retransition. Corigliano's use of recurring contrasting themes and constant pitch schemes outline a strong overarching structure. Similar to many other 20th and 21st century symphonies, the title Symphony No. 3, Circus Maximus, implies a large scope and scale more than symphonic formal structure. The narrative, as outlined through the movement's titles and program notes, is dominant throughout the work. The narrative, along with the single movement form similar to rondo, suggests that this piece is categorically more akin to a tone poem than a traditional symphony. Regardless of categorical distinction, this piece represents one of the largest scales wind ensemble pieces to date. Thank you.
I will be presenting Dr. Donald Ray Jenkins. Dr. Donald Ray Jenkins is a native of Weldon, North Carolina, and graduated as class valedictorian from Weldon High School. He received full scholarships to attend North Carolina Central University in Durham, graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. Jenkins received the Volcomenia Club Prize for Excellence in English from NCCU, given to the graduating senior with the highest average in English, and graduated with summa cum laude honors. He did his graduate work at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, Master of Arts in English Education, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, Master of Arts in American and English Literature and PhD in American and English Literature, and Shaw University Divinity School in Raleigh, North Carolina, Master of Divinity in Progress. Dr. Jenkins' areas are American Literature, English Literature, African American Literature, and Rhetoric and Composition. He has presented papers in all of these areas and is currently preparing manuscripts for publications in them. Jenkins taught high school English for 5 years and has taught college English for 17 years, having served on the faculties of the following colleges and universities: the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, Winston-Salem University, Livingston College, North Carolina Central University, North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Elizabeth City State University, College of Albemarle, Mid-Atlantic Christian University, Lane College, and Strayer University. Married to the former Linda Diane Swan of Laurinburg, North Carolina, Jenkins is an ordained Baptist minister and has served 4 charges in North Carolina. His hobbies include reading, writing, traveling, bowling, hunting, and fishing. I present to you all Dr. Donald Ray Jenkins.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to come. Those of you in my class, some of them have left. I thank you especially for coming, and be sure to sign my personal roll before you leave. 2 of my colleagues and chair of the department, Dr. Hill and Professor Andre. I'd like to talk about using African American literary texts to teach 4 modes of writing. Using African American literary texts to teach 4 modes of writing. During my 23 years, either as a university professor or a high school English teacher, I have taught composition almost every semester. This, of course, does not include my years teaching freshman composition 1 and freshman composition 2 as a teaching assistant. And let me just say in that introduction, all of those schools were not full-time positions. Many of them were adjuncts. So please don't think I've been all over the place. Inevitably, I use 3 texts: a reader, a rhetoric, and a handbook. In some cases, the 3 texts were conveniently combined into one. For example, the St. Martin's Guide to Writing. This book contains readings, guidelines for academic writing, and a handbook of grammar, usage, and mechanics. Regardless of what text or texts I used, however, I always supplemented the required books with essays, articles, poems, and short stories of my own liking. Since African American literature is one of my major academic areas, and it is an area that has not received as much scholarly attention as traditional American literature and British literature, I found and find myself using African American literary texts to teach 4 standard modes of writing: narration, description, exposition, and argumentation. My pedagogy has worked extremely well, perhaps, because my students have overwhelmingly been African American students, and because many of them have had little to almost no exposure to the plethora of Black literary texts that rightly belong in the literary canon. To be sure, the texts I use contain many of the universal themes so prevalent in mainline literature, and they address areas of writing important both to high school and college students. My presentation today will illustrate how composition instructors can effectively teach academic writing by means of African American literary texts, ensuring that students are well-grounded in what makes for good writing and are simultaneously introduced to the works of often neglected but great authors. Specifically, I will show how I use Langston Hughes' Salvation or One Friday Morning to teach narration, Charles Waddell Chestnut's The Sheriff's Children, or Honor Bontemps' A Summer Tragedy to teach description, Jane Weldon Johnson's The Creation, and Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask to teach exposition, and Martin Luther King's Letter from Birmingham Jail to teach argumentation. I always use King's letter, but sometimes I also use Ann Petrie's Like a Winding Sheet to teach argumentation by having students to make a case for the punishment or exoneration of Johnson for murdering his wife. Since most writing overlap to some extent, for example, narrative essays often contain much description and descriptive essays often contain much narration, I will explain that one piece of literature may well be used to teach more than one kind of writing. I generally began freshman composition 1 or freshman composition 2 with narrative writing and require students to write a 3-page personal essay. This works well because students write best on subjects in which they have a personal interest, and students almost always enjoy writing about themselves. This paper is due about 2 weeks into the semester. In the interim, I review the writing process, the 3 parts of any composition, and the elements like clarity, brevity, precision, and concision, and a command of standard English fundamentals, all of these things that make for good writing. Next, the class and I discuss and analyze narrations that are part of the required text. Familiar narrations include Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, and the Yellow Newspaper, and Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, works by women writers. These classic texts are useful in introducing literary terms, techniques, themes, and characters. They also introduce students to what goes into producing good literature, literature that serves as the foundation of the American literary canon. An intense study of these texts easily gives students a framework upon which to write their narrations and show how their experiences have helped them develop into the persons who they are. But African American literary texts do something more. They move students beyond works that many of them have already read in high school or have encountered in other areas of academia, or will likely encounter in their academic careers, and they offer an immediacy to which African American students can most easily relate. For example, Langston Hughes' Salvation, an autobiographical short story, is the framework story for a 12-year-old boy in a Black church. This story deals with peer pressure, irony, and deception. Most of the students have a good knowledge of the Black Baptist Church, even if they don't attend regularly, and are captivated by what young Langston does to end a lengthy church revival. In turn, they are asked to write about incidents in which they have lied, have succumbed to peer pressure, or have chosen a path that turns out differently from what they expected. Hughes' One Friday Morning offers perhaps an even more powerful episode of what so happens often in Black life. Nancy Lee, a talented African-American high school senior who was oblivious to American racial dynamics, is denied a college scholarship based solely on her race. The denial, however, initiates in Nancy Lee a determination to devote her life to excelling and fighting racism in every respectable way, thereby transforming America into what America is capable of becoming. One assignment I often give students after they have read One Friday Morning is to have them relate an experience in which they were denied something or treated differently because of their race, gender, talent, disability, or the like. Some of the essays I receive are almost unbelievable. Yet I feel good because the writing serves as a catharsis for some students. I always tell them they never have to write about anything of which they feel uncomfortable. That's narration. Descriptive writing gives me a chance to introduce students to Charles Waddell Chestnut and Anna Bontemps. Chestnut's The Sheriff's Children tells the story of a mulatto boy who is wrongly accused of murdering a white man in post-Civil War North Carolina. Tom, the mulatto, is arrested, jailed, and threatened by a lynch mob. The sheriff, though no friend to Black people, has a strong sense of duty and protects his prisoner. In a minute of carelessness, however, the sheriff loses his gun to his prisoner. As the sheriff stands before Tom, the two talk, and the sheriff learns that Tom is his son by a Black slave whom he had sold years earlier. As the standoff continues, the sheriff's daughter, Polly, enters the jail with her father's lunch and shoots Tom, her half-brother. The sheriff puts Tom back in jail, bandages his wound, and goes home. That night, the sheriff has a moral awakening and decides to cure the best legal help to exonerate Tom. only to learn upon arriving at work early the next morning that Tom has removed the bandage and has bled to death. The Sheriff's Children contains extended passages of description. For example, Chestnut begins the work with a description of the rural characters of Branson County, North Carolina, the setting. Then he gives a detailed description of the sheriff, his education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his strong sense of duty, that is, his duty except to his son. There is, moreover, the description of the confrontation between Tom and his father. Finally, there is the detailed picture of the sheriff's wrestling with his conscience as he decides upon the best course of action for Tom. Using the Sheriff's Children as their guide, students are directed to describe a person, place, thing, idea, or concept. They are instructed to move beyond the physical description definition to a description of the character of the person or place. I tell students that a description is a word picture that the reader can visually see. In other words, after reading the essays, I should have a solid idea of what that place or thing is. If Chestnuts, the Sheriff's Children, do not call students to reflect soberly, Arnold Bontemps' A Summer Tragedy will. A Summer Tragedy is the story of Jeff and Jenny Patton, two aged, decrepit black sharecroppers who commit suicide. The detailed description Bontemps gives of the stroke-stricken Jeff and blind Jenny, not to mention the accompanying illustrations, are heart-wrenching. The couple live in a dilapidated one-room shack, wear moss-ridden clothes, and are so poor that they are unable to feed their chickens. With all of their children dead, their health gone, and their material resources almost non-existent, the couple take one last ride in their Model T Ford, cruise along familiar territory as they reminisce, and drive their car into the river. One of the most striking descriptions in the work is that of the beautiful summer day, juxtaposed to the internal turmoil the struggle are facing. Equally powerful is the description of the couple's love for each other despite their outer circumstances. When I give students a descriptive paper to write, they inevitably suggest that the descriptive paper seems to be identical to the narrative paper. At this point, I remind them that all writing overlaps. That is, a good narration will have elements of description, and a good description will have elements of narration. The dominant shape of the paper, however, should be either narration or description. In regard to A Summer Tragedy, I supply students with current news articles that detail elderly murder-suicide. We discuss these, then I give them a prompt that, in some respects, almost borders on persuasion or argumentation. I ask, for example, do you agree or disagree with what the Pattons do? Thoroughly examine and justify your response. Are there positive alternatives to the Pattons' decision? Explain. How does the physical setting, especially the lovely summer day, not to mention the title, contribute to theme? Related to these prompts is compare and contrast the beauty of nature with the darkness of the Pattons' spirits. And this is the one I like best. Who is ultimately responsible for the Pattons' fate? Old Man Stevenson, the overseer, society, God, or the Pattons themselves? What does the work say about economic exploitation? How do the Pattons maintain their humanity and love toward each other despite their economic circumstances? Next comes expository writing, another favorite among my students, since all students are talented at something and are anxious to explain and share their experiences. I normally require students to do a how-to or process theme to satisfy the requirements of expository writing. Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask is fairly well known in academia. I have students memorize and cite it. Sometimes I use another one, but that's one of my favorites I use. We Wear the Mask, and they recite that for a regular grade. I grade them on what they say. In other words, how well they memorize, but also how well they present it, their gestures, their tone, and so forth. In dissecting We Wear the Mask, students and teacher define mask and tell its purpose, both its usefulness and its danger. The students then are directed to write an essay in which they define, classify, or explain something. Students are cautioned not to make their essay so mechanical that it reads like the directions on how to put something together. And this is the truth. When I did this in high school 20-some years ago, a young lady wrote an essay on how to make Kool-Aid. I'm serious. For example, students may define love, friendship, or peer pressure. Their definitions, however, must include specific examples and detail drawn from their lives. And this is where, if you have problems with your sports guys, I don't mean discipline problems, but rest assured they can explain to you how to make a three-pointer or anything about sports or how to write jazz or rap. You can get their participation. James Weldon Johnson's The Creation is another poetic work that describes a process, God's making the world. Of course, Johnson is not a theologian or student of the Bible, and he takes liberties with his poem. Therefore, students are warned not to take his message as biblically true. But Johnson's poetic treatment of the creation story in Genesis provides students with an organizing principle and a detailed structure for craft of their own how-to essay. Obviously, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end, and something happens in the middle, and something happens really in each section. There is also appropriate emphasis throughout the piece, an important element in any piece of writing. Finally, there is the right amount of pacing in the creation. The reader is not overwhelmed by too much information and neither sidetracked by extraneous information, nor ill-informed by a dearth of information. Writing, of course, always involves a delicate balance. Enough information to keep the reader knowledgeable and the subject interesting, no more and no less. One final mode of writing in which African-American literary texts can be used successfully is persuasive or argumentative writing. Teaching this type of writing is most challenging, but also most helpful. Argumentative writing cancels out all the I think, I feel, it is my opinion, to me, and similar useless expressions. The reader instead expects the writer to make a claim and provide reliable evidence to support his or her position. Supporting a stance requires serious research and hard work, both which require ample time, and I don't mean cutting and pasting from the internet. Anne Petrie's Like a Winding Sheet is a well-written story that uses both Black dialect and standard English to explore superstition, male-female relations, racism, hypocrisy, deception, and domestic violence. Johnson and his wife, May, are a simple, idyllic Black couple who enjoy each other's company. On a Friday the 13th, Johnson suffering from a leg ailment, reports to his laborer job late and is called the N-word by his supervisor, a white female. Johnson becomes extremely angry and threatens to hit his boss, but tells himself he can't hit a woman. After a difficult night at work, Johnson gets his paycheck and heads to a local cafe for a cup of coffee. The young blonde waitress throws her hair back and tells him no more coffee for a while. He feels she is slighting him because he is black and is tempted to hit her, but again, he tells himself he cannot hit a woman. The narrator tells the reader that indeed the waitress has to make a fresh pot of coffee because the last pot is exhausted. But Johnson does not know this. At any rate, he returns home and his wife attempts to play with him, but he is in no mood for teasing. Rather, he begins to complain about everything, including her hair and her chewing gum. Then she says, "You ain't nothing but a hungry hen." At that point, he begins to beat her mercilessly. The story abruptly ends, and the reader is left to wonder if he kills her. I began discussing the story with students by saying this story always leaves me asking one question. Why does Johnson beat and presumably kill his wife for calling him the N-word, yet he does nothing when his boss directs the term at him and when he thinks the blonde waitress is disrespecting him because of his race? To make the discussion more lively, I add, his wife is the woman to whom he makes love. She is the one who will probably bear him children. She is the one who cooks his meal and washes his clothes. She is the one to whom he promised to love, honor, and cherish until death they both part. Yet he murders her and merely gets angry with the white women. What's going on? The students inevitably say he will get fired if he hits his boss, and he will get in more trouble if he hits a white woman than if he hits a black woman. They also say he was simply fed up by the time he got home, so he exploded. The wife simply chose the wrong time to tease him. I then remind them he thought about hitting the white women, but used the excuse, "I can't hit a woman." I then ask, so a black woman's body is not as valuable as a white woman's body? Of course, the discussion gets extremely lively, and I'm happy because the students are thinking, and good writing begins with good thinking. This is the writing prompt I give for Like a Winding Sheet. For the sake of this assignment, assume that Johnson indeed murders his wife. You are called to serve on the jury that hears the case State versus Johnson. You have two duties. First, you have to decide if Johnson is guilty of murdering his wife. Second, you have to recommend the punishment for Johnson. These are your options. Johnson is guilty of first-degree murder and must be sentenced to death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. If he is guilty of intentional manslaughter and must spend a minimum of 20 years in prison before he is eligible for parole. Johnson is not guilty by reason of insanity, but must be committed to a mental hospital until he is able to function as a responsible member of society. To find Johnson guilty of first-degree murder, you must find that he had time to think about what he was doing, even if it was just a few seconds, and did it anyway. That's called premeditation. If his act was particularly cruel and heinous, and you find no mitigating circumstances, you must recommend the death penalty. If you find mitigating circumstances, you must recommend that he serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. If you find Johnson killed his wife without having time to think about his actions, you must find him guilty of intentional manslaughter and recommend that he be sentenced to 20 years in prison before he's eligible for parole. If you find that Johnson was not in control of his mental faculties when he killed his wife, you must find him not guilty by reason of insanity and recommend that he be placed in a psychiatric facility until competent doctors decide he is no longer a threat to himself or society. Before I give students the argumentative writing prompt, I always discuss the elements of classical orations. For example, introduction, narration, confirmation, development of the listed reasons with specific details, examples, facts, figures, concession, rebuttal, and conclusion. And I show them how this can easily be adapted to persuasive writing. The best nonfiction essay I have found to teach argumentative writing is Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It covers almost the whole gamut of argumentative writing. He includes the three types of classical appeals, to logos, to ethos, and to pathos. He includes literary devices, metaphors, repetition, similes, and allusions. He has an introduction/narration, reasons, extensive support for his reasons, concession and rebuttal, and a conclusion. He is ever mindful of his audience. On one level, he is an educated preacher writing to educated preachers. On another level, he is a common man speaking to humanity. He shares personal experiences to give authenticity to his position. His writing is urbane, but also simple and clear. His tone is sincere and powerful, but not angry. I always have students to download the full text of King's letter and the full text of the minister's letter to King. Moreover, I give them ample information on the civil rights movement, since the movement does not seem to resonate too much with today's Black students. Sometimes I will show parts of Eyes on the Prize or All the Four Little Girls and videos on Emmett Till. It takes at least 2 weeks for me to satisfactorily cover King's letter. Assessment includes 100 questions, which count for 200 points, factual tests, and an essay, the old-fashioned multiple choice essay. Among the essay topics are, is King's letter relevant today? Why or why not? Are Black-white relations in America where they ought to be today? Explain with specific details and examples. Some scholars have suggested that King's letter be added as a book to the New Testament. Do you agree or disagree? Why? The traditional works of American literature are quite appropriate for teaching the four modes of writing: narration, description, exposition, and argumentation. African American literary texts simply offer alternatives to these often overused texts, and my students, most of whom are Black, seem to become more engaged in class discussion when African American literary texts are substituted for traditional texts. Literature is ultimately about life, and if I can get students to reflect on what makes life what it is, I have earned my pay and my satisfaction. Thank you.
Our next and final speaker for today will be Dr. Proctor. John Ray Proctor holds a Bachelor in English from Westford University in St. Louis, Missouri, an MFA in acting from West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, and he earned a PhD in theater research with a primary focus on Shakespeare studies from the University of Wisconsin, Madison in 2011. The focus of his dissertation considered the ways in which mid-20th century theater audiences learned to negotiate issues of class, race, and integration within the framework of a particular 1942 production of Othello that featured Paul Robeson. Prior to earning his PhD, Proctor also had an extensive career as an actor across the country. In the Chicago-Milwaukee region, he has appeared as a member of the ensemble for Ain't Misbehavin', as Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, an ensemble member of Between Men and Cattle Peter Lorraine Hansberry's Les Blancs, and Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. He has performed in the national tours of Big River and Buddy, the Buddy Holly story. He has performed the title role in Othello in New York, West Virginia, St. Louis, Tucson, and Chicago. Last January, the play Proctor co-authored with Miss Olivia Dawson, Out Loud, opened at Ada Creative Arts Foundation on Chicago's South Side. The play ran for 9 weeks and received outstanding reviews. In July, Chicago's Black Theater Alliance announced that Proctor and Dawson's Out Loud had received 7 2014 Black Theater Alliance nominations: Best Play, Best New Script, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Ensemble. Dr. Proctor is thrilled to be the Director of Theater here at Albany State University. He is also excited and honored to direct Alice Childress's Trouble in Mind this fall and the Horowitz and Maltby Fats Waller musical review Ain't Misbehavin' this coming spring here at Albany State University. Please help me present Dr. John Ray Proctor.
Before I begin, I'm going to use 2 phrases that I just want everybody to know how I'm using them. The first is spectacle text. Spectacle text refers to the play in performance, and then play text, which refers to the material play in your hand. This is a selection from a piece that's a bit longer. What sense had I in her stolen hours of lust? I saw it not, I thought it not, it harmed not me. I slept the next night well, fed well, was free and merry. I found not Cassio's kisses on her lips. He that is robbed, not wanting what is stolen, let him not know it, and he's not robbed at all. I had been happy if the general camp, pioneers and all, had tasted her sweet body, so I had nothing known. Oh, now forever farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content, farewell the plumed troops and the big wars that make ambition virtue. Farewell. Farewell the neighing steed, the shrill trump, the spirit-stirring drum, the ear-piercing fife, the royal banner and all quality, pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war. And O you mortal engines, whose rude throats the immortal Jove's dread clamors counterfeit, farewell. Othello's occupation's gone. Villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore. Be sure of it. Give me the ocular proof, or by the worth of mine eternal soul, thou hadst better been born a dog than answer my waked wrath. Make me to see it. Or at the least, so prove it that the probation bear no hinge nor loop to hang a doubt on, or woe upon thy life. If thou dost slander her and torture me, never pray more. Abandon all remorse. On horror's head, horrors accumulate. Do deeds to make heaven weep. All earth amazed, for nothing canst thou to damnation add greater than that. Make me to see it. This is how Othello addresses Iago. A search for transcendental truth contained within the play text of Othello would concern themes of love, jealousy, and the nobility of the soul. Othello's transcendent has been the purview of literary critics as far back as Thomas Rymer. In 1692, Rymer examined the permutations and manifestations of that green-eyed monster jealousy because he was disgusted that Shakespeare had made Othello a blackamoor. More often than not, Othello's color removes consideration of this play from the objectivity of the universal to the subjectivity of perspective. Othello, perhaps much more so than many of Shakespeare's other texts, contains an othered construction of race that ruptures any illusion of transcendent truth. The text of Othello is divisive. Of course, it is no more divisive than any other play that divides characters by gender or class. Othello's texts, however, divides and distinguishes the characters by race and attributes physical and behavioral characteristics along racial lines. For instance, these Moors are changeable in their wills. Fill thy purse with money. The food that to him now is luscious as locusts shall be to him shortly as bitter as colloquintada. Othello is characterized by his thick lips, sooty bosom, and begrimed black face. This play is no more favorable to the racial other than it is to the gendered other. Descriptions of women include Iago's, "I know our country disposition well. In Venice, they do let heaven see the pranks that they dare not show their husbands. Their best conscience is not to leave it undone, but to keep it unknown." Though both of these descriptions come from Iago, they're easily conferred upon and echoed by Brabantio, Roderigo, and in more subtle ways, the Duke and Senators of Venice. According to Marvin Carlson, the model reader is the possible reader assumed by the author to whom the book is imaginatively directed, a reader supposedly able to deal interpretively with the expressions in the same way as the author deals generatively with them. It is difficult to determine who might be the model reader. It is difficult to determine who might be the model reader for the audience of Othello. Othello is racially othered from the audiences of 1601. But so too are female characters, marginalized, disparaged, and othered. It is a generalization and not terribly nuanced to suggest that Shakespeare's intended audience for Othello were white males. But it's also pretty safe to say that black people and women were not the core of English theater audiences in 1601 or 1604. When what gets submerged or glossed over in this construction is the fact that in the dramatic text of the characterization of white masculinity is also a constructed fiction. In this instance, the subjectivity of perspective is useful in describing the ways in which a model audience might identify with the spectacle text. Nietzsche's riposte against transcendence is his assertion that there is no absolute truth, ergo, there is no universal, thus there is no transcendence. Truth can only be known from the context of one's perspective. This is accomplished through an appreciation of the emotional relationship between two perceptions, the perceiver and the other. There were not very many black audiences of Othello until the African Grove Theater Company in 1821. Racially, most audiences of Othello were predominantly white until the casting convention changed with Paul Robeson in 1942 to include a black actor in the title role. Kim Hall argues public theater was not a safe place for women in early modern audiences. The women that attended theater were accompanied by men or their reputations were questioned. The theater offered a license for intercourse. Globe attendance was primarily male, says Hall. It lacks nuance to suggest that Shakespeare's model audience was white and male because such a description does not provide much information. It does not consider economic class, station, education, or orientation, sexual orientation. This generalization does, however, categorize a group of audience member that the spectacle did include, from which both females and blacks were othered. Sheila Rose Bland describes early productions of Othello as a white fraternal minstrel show and considers the production along the lines of race. Is the death of such a black man tragic? Because the white woman Othello kills was meant to be played by a white man in a dress, and Othello himself was meant to be played by a white man in blackface. Othello too is an effigy. He gets his comeuppance in the eyes of the white audience viewing the play, and the white actor doing the play, and the white man who wrote the play. Othello's only redeeming quality under these circumstances is that he has the good sense to kill himself. Othello himself recognizes what an abomination he is. Like the base Judean threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe. No human being of any race in his right mind would say such a thing about the entirety of his own race. One white woman is worth more than all black men, women, and children in the world. See, that's just preposterous. My purpose is not to take Shakespeare to task for being racist. Rather, it is to highlight the fact that early modern audiences for which this play was written were not so egalitarian as to cater to the black or female perspectives. Dramatic texts, however, are not static. Play texts are written with an aesthetic and a semiotic framework, and are intended to be performed and therefore exist temporally in time. Even if the play text has remained consistent with the processes of even if the play text has remained consistent and with the processes of printing, editing, copying, recovery, and recording, it assuredly has not. The performers have changed. Women can now play female roles, and people of color can now play the racially othered characters. Audiences are no longer asked to construct meaning upon or interpret white male actors representing black or female identity, unless it is a dramatic convention that is being intentionally employed by the production. Between 1604 and 1816, white actors would use a combination of lumpash, which is lump ash, and lamp oil for the black makeup. The color achieved by the utilization of this makeup was coal black and onyx black, not any shade of brown or sub-Saharan Negro skin color. The white actors who had blacked up to play Othello had also left their hands white. Had left their hands white. We're talking about Richard Burbage. He was the first actor to play Othello in 1601. Burbage's Othello was not brown, he was black. It is probable that his hands were not covered in makeup. The reasons for this were practical. Covering an actor's hands in black makeup would mean that he would get black smudges on his costumes, every prop he touched, and the other actors. Leaving their hands white signified whiteness to the audiences, thereby reassuring them that the actor playing Othello was in fact white. The audience was reassured of the actor's racial identity every time Othello touched Desdemona by his white hands. White audiences could suspend their disbelief and lose themselves in the fiction of the spectacle text precisely because they were reassured by the stage picture that the fiction being represented on stage was in fact just that, a fiction. Othellos with black faces and white hands continued from Burbage in 1604 all the way through the Bronze Age of Othello by Edmund Kean in 1816. Kean changed the makeup technique for playing and representing black Othello. Kean substituted a light brown makeup for the coal black. Oddly, Kean's makeup invention shifted Othello's representation from a sign that represented only otherness to a representation of black skin color that actually could have occurred in nature. Kean's new Bronze Othello, although the predominantly white audiences of Europe and America found it more appealing, it stoked a greater fear of miscegenation and actual black men having sexual relations with white women, precisely because the new makeup technique looked more like black people than had the coal black Othellos that preceded it. Prior to Robeson, theatrical convention and makeup assured audiences of the whiteness of the actors playing Othello. Audiences were absolutely aware of the divide between the fiction of the play and the reality that was being represented on stage. While the play might represent the spectacle of a black man and a white woman being married, holding hands and kissing, the reality of the white actor beneath the blackface makeup was always evident. In the context of the development of racial hierarchy, racial subjugation, and the structures that reinforced ideologies of white supremacy and black inferiority that characterized the enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans, the transatlantic slave trade, and slavery in America, assuring white audiences that the actor playing Othello was white was absolutely essential. Though readers of the play text imagine what the characters look like, there are semiotic differences between reading the play text of Othello and viewing the play in production. Pointing to this difference, Ruth Cowhig wrote, "Historically, critics and editors have tended to neglect Othello in performance for the literary, a preference that allowed them to ignore Othello's race if they so desired. There's the often quoted woman from Maryland, and that's in quotes, who always imagined the hero to be a white man in order to justify her vision of an Othello with noble European features to mitigate the effects of his dark skin. Readers of the play text are afforded the luxury of inscribing their own imaginings of the character, making the author's intent irrelevant. If the reader did not want to or could not imagine a black man having the noble characteristics attributed to the Moor, their imagination might simply construct an Othello that was just not black." Thank you.
Okay, my first question is for Dr. Bonner. To my understanding, the idea of blues is to get one's thoughts down on paper during hard times, but it is seen as therapeutic. That's what I got from your presentation. Since the lives or portraits of the women in the poem seem to reflect those of today, do you think women experiencing these tragic circumstances should consider writing the blues or just writing, period, to help them through their circumstances?
Absolutely. Writing is therapy, just like singing is therapy or listening to a gospel song. So in singing the blues or speaking about your problems, I think it's very therapeutic and soothing. Even though it's like sweet blues. How can the blues, which are supposed to be sad songs, be so sweet to you? So I think there's some cathartic effect and therapeutic effect from writing, singing, and things like that. Thank you.
My question is, do you see a female whom is considered a blues woman or possibly someone similar in the works of other African American poets? And if you do, would you consider extending your research to that individual's work as well?
That's a very good question. Absolutely. You find blues women in the world of Rosie Polk, which you've read. You find blues women in all types of novels and stories. I just happen to focus on Langston Hughes' poetry, but the concept can be applied to any African American woman struggling and surviving. Thank you.
Other questions, comments, suggestions, concerns?
Okay, my next question is for Dr. Brown. Do you see this same idea of pitch scheme commonality occurring in other pieces by John Corigliano or any other composer? I guess I'm saying, is this something that he specifically is known for, or is it a common musical element?
It's a very common musical element. In fact, in common practice music theory, which is music written from about 1650 to 1900 or so, the tonic dominant relationships that are throughout traditional music, they all contain common tones. So what he's really doing is he's taking something from the traditional music scheme and applying it to new postmodern ideals with different pitch schemes. So he's essentially expanding a previous concept instead of reinventing one.
Thank you. Okay, my next one is for Dr. Jenkins, and I also like to comment. I like your pedagogy. It reminds me a lot of Dr. Bonner's. But my question is, do you think this teaching style better serves students in their process to academic writing as opposed to a classroom environment that is not centered upon Afrocentrism? Why or why not?
I don't know that it's better. I think it's equivalent to good teaching is good teaching and good writing is good writing. I think it motivates the students more, though. Particularly, most of my students are African American students. Even the white students often have not been exposed to this kind of literature. So I don't know that it's better. I think it's equivalent to, it's equal to, but it does engage them more. And learning is, a teacher does many things, and one thing we try to do is to engage the students. We can get them to talking, and they will talk about things they relate to.
Okay,
All right.
this one is for Dr. Proctor. I noticed that you mentioned that you are not suggesting that Shakespeare is racist. However, the usage of the coal black makeup to show black skin, you don't think that implies something?
Our concept of race is a relatively modern invention, and it's always growing. So the way we think about race is vastly so. The the African slave trade, the discovery of Africa, the movement of slaves from Africa to the Americas collectively, the industry that it is. In 1604, it's a burgeoning industry. It is something that is coming alive. People are being discovered. So they're particularly Europe in the early modern period, their connection with sub-Saharan African is so minimal that their concept of blackness doesn't. It's in its formative years, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
And where we are now, when we think about race, we are after 400 years of many things that have influenced. So when I say that the black-faced wasn't meant to be racist, it's because blackness blackness in the early modern period, particularly in England, they don't have very many black people. They have some who exist as oddities or circus creatures. That's the way they appeared. They were kept as pets or household boys, if you will, by the very, very rich, and they were a rarity, right? So there was no connection to what it meant to be black. So when I say that it's not racist, what I'm saying is our conception of racist has no bearing on what England looked like in 1604, 1601.
Thank you.
Now, again, we want to thank you for coming out and staying around. Again, this is the Fine Arts and English Department Colloquium series. The next series will be the English Department series in the spring. And continuing in that, we're working our way towards the Hip Hop Conference. We also have the Film and Book Club that will be beginning in October. Please make sure that you sign the sheet before you leave if you did not. Enjoy the rest of your day, and please give them a rounding hand again. Thank you very much.